Hi, welcome to Curator's Corner, the Nazi Spy Ring in America. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us today. Spy Museum historian and curator Dr. Andrew Hammond will be formally introducing you to our speaker, Dr. Rhodri Jeffreys-Jones, and let's hand it over to these really fascinating men. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Rhodri.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So it's my distinct honour to welcome Rhodri Jeffreys-Jones, Professor Emeritus at the University of Edinburgh. So anybody who looks at the history of intelligence knows who Rhodri is. I can't really say a bigger compliment than that. He's the author of well over a dozen books. I think we're up to around 17 now, Rhodri, is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. So we're up to 17 books. I could talk for quite a period of time about his resume and so forth, but you can look that up for yourself. The best demonstration of his expertise is for you just to listen closely and hear Rhodri tell us more about his research. Take it away, Rhodri. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Amanda, and thank you to the backroom team, Hannah and Shona. Now, as the title of my book suggests, today's talk is about the role of the FBI in bringing to justice a ring of Nazi spies in America. The story revolves around the activities of a brilliant detective and counter spy, Leon G. Turrou. His activities can be said to have contributed to the demise of American neutrality in the 1930s. Now, the political background is, as you will all know, that in the mid-1930s, the United States was committed to neutrality. At the same time, Germany, having recovered from its position of notoriety in the First World War, Germany was making a bid to bring the United States within its orbit. The Neutrality Acts of 35, 36, and 37 established an arms and trade embargo on all belligerent nations and in regard to civil wars, and they gave Ambassador Hans-Heinrich Dierkhoff, the German ambassador in Washington, the hope that he could win over the American press corps and opinion. His efforts reflected Hitler's early admiration for the United States. He especially admired Henry Ford. He had a very high opinion of American technology. He thought also that German Americans, who were a numerous proportion of the American population, could be used as a means of leverage to bring the United States within the German orbits. And yet at the same time, Hitler risked all this good feeling by encouraging and initiating an effort to steal United States military secrets. The idea was to build up German rearmaments by borrowing on American technology, which by this time in the history of the world was becoming preeminent amongst the technologies of the various nations. But the United States was unprepared for this. Counterintelligence really was at a very low ebb if it existed properly at all. And American industry was also unprepared for the onslaught of the Nazi spy ring. Now, I think one of the ways of explaining what the spy ring was about is to explain what kind of booty they obtained. They obtained, for example, the hull design of a new generation of American destroyers. Now, this proved to be false booty because the United States Navy changed its design soon after that. The design that the Germans got involved an aluminum alloy, and they dropped the plan because it was cracking in the hulls. But they also, and this is quite a well-known example, got hold of the Norden bomb site. Carl Norden was an engineer who operated in Manhattan, and he developed a gyroscopic bomb site, which meant that it could steady the delivery of a bomb to its target, meaning greater accuracy and less collateral damage. Now, in Norden's factory in Manhattan, there was an employee called Hermann Lang, and in 1937, he gave to Nikolaus Ritter, who was one of the spies of the German Secret Service, the Abwehr, he gave him the blueprint for this bomb site. And Ritter smuggled the blueprint onto a German ship, the Alliance. He put it into a rolled up umbrella, a specially adapted umbrella for carrying documents. It was quite interesting to see that the Germans did a lot of physical transport of secret documents on ships which were governed by members of the Nazi Party by the 1930s. So the captain would take his orders from a member of the Nazi Party. And they did this in part, I think, because they no longer trusted the cables, because their codes had been broken in the First World War. So they got hold of that bomb site. They got hold of the aircraft retraction system. Could we see the first slide, please? The aircraft retraction system on the new generation of aircraft carriers, and this is one of them, the USS Yorktown, a photograph taken in 1939. Okay, that's the end of that image. Thank you. They also obtained a code deciphering machine under development in the United States. And I'm going to choose my words carefully here. Involved in the design of that machine was a woman called Agnes Driscoll. Now, the FBI document dealing with the case notes that her maiden name was Meyer. She was of German-American descent on her father's side. And according to FBI sources, and this is complex, according to FBI sources, she sold that design for a code-breaking machine to the Abwehr, the German Secret Service, for the sum of $7,000. And the Abwehr gave as an explanation for her treachery the fact that she was aggrieved because the Navy had bought the same machine and had paid her only $6,250. And furthermore, when Agnes Driscoll had an automobile accident and was unable to work for the Navy, they stopped her wages. And she felt very bitter about that and was therefore prepared to sell this machine to the Germans. Agnes Driscoll was in 1971 interred at the Arlington National Cemetery as an American hero. So that's one type of information that the Abwehr sought, technical information, which would help them to build up their armed forces. And the second kind of information was much more aggressive. They wanted to get hold of information on American defenses, such as the defenses on the east coast of the United States, the defenses around the Panama Canal, clearly with intent to attack should the occasion arrive and need arise. So that is quite aggressive. Now, could we see the next image, please? I think that as a short way of explaining about German spies, we can show a few images. This is Willy Lankowski, whose code name was Sex. Lankowski was an German Air Force pilot in the First World War. When the Abwehr was formed in 1921 in contravention of the Treaty of Versailles, he became an agent for the new agency. He spied on France to begin with, and in 1927 was sent to the United States. And he slowly built up a spy ring, which was quite productive by 1935, when he was spotted trying to board a ship in New York Harbor carrying a suspicious-looking parcel, and on inspection, that parcel contained secret documents about American aircraft designs. Rather naively, he was told to report back in 3 days for further questioning by military intelligence, and he took the opportunity to get in a fast car and disappear to the Canadian border, where and in Canada he took a ship back to Germany. Next image, please. Now, the next image is of Eric Pfeiffer, seen here with his mistress, Hilde Gelsdorf, who accompanied him everywhere. Now, Pfeiffer was handpicked by Admiral Canaris, who was in charge of the Abwehr in Germany, and asked to set up a special substation in Bremen for the sole purpose of spying on the United States, which he did with considerable success. He's an interesting character. He had a dueling scar on his left cheek, which tells you something about his social background. He served on the German flagship, the König, in the Battle of Jutland in 1916, so he'd seen real military action. He was a respected member of the traditional German officer class, in this case, a naval officer. So he was in charge in the period leading up to 1938, which my book is mainly about. Next image, please. This is the SS Bremen. This is one of the crack German liners, passenger boats, which plied the Atlantic, and which was, this particular vessel held the blue ribbon for the fastest crossing of the Atlantic prior to the taking of this photograph, by which time it had been overtaken by French, British, and American ships. So it's a crack ship, but it was very much under Nazi control. And if you see the next image, please. This image is by the Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist, Jacob Burke. And as you can see, it's quite a graphic portrayal. North German Lloyd is on the bow of the ship. That's the big German shipping company. And the Nazi rat is running down the rope with the purpose of infecting American youth, especially German American youth, and of course liaising with German spies. And that's quite a graphic image from 1935. Okay, thank you. Take that away, please, now. Now, I'd like to say something about the contribution of MI5. MI5 is the British counterintelligence agency, and in January 1938, on the 17th of that month, 17th of January 38, MI5 intercepted a letter sent by a person calling himself Crown, a letter sent from New York to Dundee in Scotland. Now, this is how I got onto this story. Originally, I wanted to know about this letter and what it told us, and I submitted a Freedom of Information request to the FBI, and they very helpfully produced, or unhelpfully, depends on your point of view, produced 14,500 documents. Okay, the letter goes from an agent calling himself Crown to Dundee. In Dundee, there was a post restaurant, a woman, Jessie Jordan, and her job was to transmit these letters on to Hamburg, which is the main American spy station at that point in Germany. Why this circuitous route? Well, it was an attempt to throw off counterintelligence agents in the United States. So MI5 intercepts the letter, steams it open before sending it on its way, and they discover that there's a plot to assassinate an American army officer, Colonel Henry Eglin. He was to be lured to the McAlpin Hotel At first, it was contemplated that he would be lured by means of a honey trap, a courier on one of the German ships called Jenny Hoffmann, a beautiful redhead. She was to lure him to the McAlpin Hotel. At any rate, he was to be encouraged to visit the McAlpin Hotel in possession of the East Coast defense plans of the United States. He was based in Fort Totten and had access to these, he was privy to these plans. The plan was that he'd arrive in a hotel room in the McAlpin, and from behind a curtain, an Abwehr agent would pounce on Colonel Eglin and inject him with the contents of a fountain pen, which is, or what looked like a fountain pen, but is actually a syringe. And then the US Army officer would be left prostrate. The villains would get away with the blueprints, and they would leave behind a copy of the Daily Worker in order to incriminate the Communist Party of the United States. So this is the purport of the letter that MI5 obtained. Well, it seems a rather unlikely plot, but MI5 thought there was a serious possibility that Eglin might be killed. So they tipped off the Americans, and that's how the United States got onto the case. The FBI was alerted, and the FBI put Leon Turrou in charge. Leon Turrou, now fairly obscure character, but in those days regarded as America's best detective. And much of my book rests on evidence from FBI files concerning Turrou. So who was this guy? And if you could have the image, please, next image. This is an image of Turrou bearing a gun. The FBI at this stage had begun to issue weapons to its special agents and to train them in their use. Hoover had initially been against carrying weapons, but in this mobster era, they did that. So Turrou, of course, was no stranger to guns, as he'd been in action in the First World War. Next image, please. And the next image is of Turrou in a more pensive mode, and I think that's more typical because his contribution was, although he was a very tough guy, there's no question about that, his contribution was cognitive to the breaking up of the spy ring. Okay, thank you for that image. We'll take that off now. Now, Turrou was born Turovsky in a Russian-controlled Polish town called Kobrin in 1895. Turrou was a consummate liar. It was a trait that gave his detractors ammunition, and people still hold that against him. Although, on the other hand, his mendacity helped him to detect mendacity in those people he was interviewing. Turrou claimed to be an orphan in order to get the sympathy of his audiences, but he wasn't. He denied being Jewish, but he was Jewish. And one reason he denied being Jewish when he was a young man was that he was quoting Christian girls. For example, just after arriving in the United States, he had a girlfriend called Olga, who was Russian Orthodox. But he tried to disguise the fact that he was Jewish, but didn't get away with it, and her family realized they were anti-Semitic, and that was the end of that. So what you do when your girlfriend chucks you join the French Foreign Legion, or so he said. But if you look at the records of the French Foreign Legion, there's no record of his having fought with them in the First World War. He must have fought with other units. He was wounded. And that's how he met his next girlfriend, Teresa, who was a Polish Catholic. So once again, it came in handy to deny that he was Jewish. Well, Turrou eventually joined the Bureau and worked on 3,000 cases, including the famous Lindbergh case. And as I mentioned, came to be regarded as the FBI's crack detective. And indeed, he cracked the Nazi spy case. And my book explains how I tried to write it in a thriller style, but it's a thriller with footnotes. 4 people were finally convicted. A guy called Gunther Rumrich, who was the guy who had posed as Crown and wrote that letter, his assistant Erich Glaser, Jenny Hoffmann, whom I mentioned, in connection with the honeytrap, and Otto Voss, who was the person who had betrayed the design of the American fighter planes. The trial in the autumn of in the fall of 1938 was a spectacle. People were shocked by what it revealed, but also it was a kind of gruesome entertainment. For example, the story of Kate Moog. Image, please. The next slide, please. Kate Moog was someone who said that she had been the nurse to Franklin Delano Roosevelt when he was fighting against Polo in the 1920s. And she said she'd got to know members of the American military and political establishment because of that assignment. A close examination of the records of the Roosevelt estate examined that this was a lie. They indicated this was a lie, but she claimed that. Okay, that's the end of that image, thank you. And she claimed that, and her lover, a man called Ignaz Griebel, who's a notorious New York anti-Semite, took her to meet Pfeiffer in Bremen, and then they proceeded to the Hotel Adlon in Berlin. Next image, please. This is the Hotel Adlon. You can see the Brandenburg Gate down in the left bottom, and behind it is the reconstructed Hotel Adlon. It was burned down at one point and it's been reconstructed. And from there they went to the Bender Block. Next image, please. Bender Block is where the German military had their headquarters, and Canaris, the head of the Abwehr, had a desk with his back to one of those balcony windows. So they met him in his office and concocted the plan, which was that she was to return to the United States and set up what was euphemistically called a salon in Washington, D.C., in fact, a brothel. No expenses spared. Members of the American political elite, and as well as naval and army officers, were to be invited there in circumstances which would lead to their entrapment, leading to blackmail and to their becoming spies for Germany. Now, this was part, I think, of the Mata Hari complex the Germans had. Next image, please. Mata Hari, the famous spy, she was Dutch, in fact, but spied for Germany in the First World War, was said to have been responsible for the death of 40,000 French soldiers, was executed in 1917 by the French for her part in that espionage. Probably not nearly as important as people made out, but the Germans had become fixated with the use of glamorous women. I've given you another example already, Jenny Hoffman. She too, and the American press also thought this, that were entranced by the Mata Hari idea. That Ingrid Bergman had acted in a film called Mata Hari. It was very much in the American consciousness. Okay, let's remove that. What the Germans couldn't do was to think of women as potential spies where they would need to use their brains. Okay, I'd like to turn now to the campaign run by Turrou. Just after the suspects had been arrested and before they were put on trial in the fall of 1938, Turrou resigned from the FBI and started a campaign. He still would not say that he was a Jew because he thought that his campaign, which is against the Nazis and against anti-Semitism, and revealing the story of the spying and how perfidious the Americans were, the German spies were, he said he felt he couldn't make the argument as a Jew because people would point to him and say he's biased, he's a Jew. He would say that, wouldn't he? So he still kept that aspect of his identity confidential. So even before the trial started, he sold his story to the New York Post, and after the trial had concluded, the New York Post serialized his story, which also came out as a book. He embarked on a lecture tour in 1939. Even as of February 1940, he was still scheduled to give 53 more lectures, each for a fee of $500. He had been the best paid agent in the FBI, but he was making a lot more money because of his literary activities, his speaking activities, and because he sold the story to Hollywood. The movie Confessions of a Nazi Spy came out of the Warner Brothers studio and was released in May 1939. If you could see the next image, please. This is of Griebel. This image is of Griebel addressing a crowd. Griebel was the anti-Semitic gynecologist who was a lover of Kate Moog and took her to see Canaris, and here he is addressing the faithful. Next image, please. This one is of Griebel in real life. It's an FBI image. And the next one, please. This is a publicity shot to publicize Confessions of a Nazi Spy. And here we see Edward G. Robinson, who was actually a Jew from Eastern Europe. And the Warner Brothers was also Jewish. And here's Turrou looking at a copy of Turrou's book. Two guys looking at the book. The film is based on the book. Okay, thank you. Finish with that image now. Now, this campaign run by Turrou was pretty powerful. Clearly, there were other contributors to it. For example, Ernest Hemingway, the novelist, campaigned against the Nazis and warned about the fifth column and how dangerous Nazi spies were. And my argument is that this was a domestic event. These spies had operated within the United States, great sensational trial taking place in New York, and it had a greater impact on opinion than foreign events, such as, for example, Kristallnacht, which took place in November 1938, contemporaneously with the Nazi spy trial. At any rate, public opinion changed, and by February 1939, 65% of those polled favored the sale of airplanes in contravention to the Neutrality Acts to Britain and France. And by 1939, when war broke out in Europe, only 2% of those polled supported Germany and 84% favored the Allies. And I think that, if I may, I'd like to mention the impact of this change in public opinion on the Germans' attitudes. Hans-Heinrich Dierkopf, the German ambassador, had entertained the hope that opinion had changed on Germany because of the Neutrality Acts and other events in the mid-1930s. But he became thoroughly disillusioned when the spy cases were revealed. And I think it's quite interesting that in the First World War, in the period of neutrality, the German spies in the United States had been run from the embassy. But this time, those in the embassy, and Dierkopf was not a great fan of Adolf Hitler, lamented, well, in fact, they claimed to be ignorant of what was going on. They must have had suspicions, but they were clearly annoyed at what was going on. Well, Dierkopf was suddenly recalled in the course of the trial and replaced by Hans Thomsen. Spy cases continued to rumble in the news, and he reported to Berlin that German espionage and sabotage in the United States was, quote, the surest way of bringing America into action on the side of our enemies and of destroying the last vestiges of sympathy for Germany. Now that telegraph was forwarded by the German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop directly to the Führer. So it was taken seriously at the top. But nevertheless, the Nazi Party continued to encourage the activities of secret agents in the United States. Nevertheless, Germany had taken note of the change in opinion in America, and Hitler had written America off well before 1939. Some other consequences of the spy story: in the wake of the Great Spy Scare, the FBI went from strength to strength. Turrou was fired by Hoover for going to the press, and Hoover then blacklisted him. After the Second World War, Turrou went to live in France, and he died there many years later. So he fell out of public view. So he was vilified by Hoover, and then he went, as it were, into exile. And I think that's probably the main reason why he's so little known in the United States today. He spent the remainder of his life in exile in Paris, a forgotten but still significant figure. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Rhodri. I like the way that you described it, a thriller with footnotes. And I read the book in preparation for today, and it really does read like that. It's really well written, but there's great scholarship going on there too. So strongly recommended. You can get it at the Spy Museum online store. One of the first things I wanted to touch on was you mentioned Turrou and J. Edgar Hoover's campaign against him. To what extent is he known now within the FBI? So people that are in the FBI, is that part of their history, or is his story still kind of submerged and you're trying to bring it up for more people to hear it?
Well, the FBI has taken note of Turrou. As you know, they've got a website where you can pull up all kinds of interesting details about the FBI's history. And John Fox over in the FBI is making great efforts in this regard. So if you look at the section on Turrou, he's mentioned, but he's mentioned as the person who was dismissed with prejudice. That's the phrase used in his dismissal notes by J. Edgar Hoover. It's like something like a dishonorable discharge from the armed forces, dismissed with prejudice. So I've had a little communication with John Fox, and I said now that we know more about Turrou, perhaps that account on the FBI website can be modified a little bit.
Okay, I look forward to looking at that page when it's done. Turrou strikes me as a really fascinating figure. He'd done all of these amazing things. He spoke 7 languages. He may or may not have been in the French Foreign Legion. He, cracked the Lindenberg kidnapping case. I wondered if you had a better sense of him as a man. Why would somebody who done such amazing things, and you describe him as a tangle of half-truths and lies, why, I don't know, what did you get a sense of, like, him as a man? Like, what's going on? He seems like an interesting contradiction.
Well, he is a contradiction. I mean, he does come across as a scoundrel, and some people have dredged up some information about him, which on the surface is much more damaging than anything that I mentioned in my book even. But I think that, like a lot of people, he's a mixture of good and bad. In his case, the mixture is pretty extreme. It's kind of polarized. So I think that he sees an opportunity. I don't think he's actually out to redeem himself in running this campaign against the Nazis, but he feels very strongly about it. He's witnessed anti-Semitism at first hand in Poland, came from Poland, and feels very strongly about the rise of the Nazis. You can see what a threat that is, and you can see an acute need to oppose that tendency. So he's acting from principle. So what you have here is the development of a strong moral sense inside somebody who's an imperfect person. And I don't think that's really unique. I mean, you could argue, for example, that Andrew Carnegie, who was one of your compatriots, was a pretty ruthless man, whereas he was building up his immense fortune in culminating and dominating the steel industry in the United States. But then, having been ruthless, he gets a mission, which is world peace, and he begins to campaign for that, and also it gives vast amounts of money away to good causes such as education, libraries, and so on. And I don't think it's unusual for someone to be a blend of good and bad.
A fascinating figure for sure. And you spoke a little bit about some of the prejudice that he was subject to, and I know from your book that you got a hold of a lot of FBI documents, personnel files, and so forth. And he also suffered from prejudice stateside over here in the US. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, he did suffer from a prejudice. For example, within the FBI files, in his personnel file, which then went through a transition and became a file on him when FBI, when J. Edgar Hoover took against him. But even in the early stage, when it was just his personnel file, people are saying that he looks funny. He didn't look American. And he himself describes himself as having high cheekbones and being Russian in appearance. So he was aware that he looked a bit different. I don't know what the conception of what an American is supposed to look like is really, because there's a huge variation in America between people. But people in the FBI noted that. Of course, he had an accent. He spoke English very well, but he had an accent. He was just 5'6" tall, which was smaller in stature than a lot of the FBI agents. He did not have a law degree, but although it wasn't laid down as a statute that you had to have a law degree to become an FBI special agent, people objected to his being an agent for that reason. And in fact, he had to wait several years. He tried to get into the FBI in 1921, and J. Edgar Hoover, who was the assistant director of the FBI at that point, was very, very keen to have him because he realized how very talented this guy was. But he had to wait until 1929 before he could get in, partly because of cuts in the budget of the FBI in the 1920s, but also because there was prejudice against him. And the reason why he got in was that he campaigned for Herbert Hoover in the 1928 presidential election. He campaigned in the ethnic districts of Manhattan. He spoke all these languages, so he could get up in a platform and say what a great guy Herbert Hoover was. And so there was a payoff after that. And in fact, it was William J. Donovan, Bill Donovan, who, of course, went on to become the director of the OSS, who was one of the more important intermediaries in getting him that FBI job, and signed off on it as the Assistant Attorney General.
And would it be fair to say that Turrou is the hero, if you want to put it like that, of the book?
Yes, he is the hero of the book. There's an element of anti-hero, of course, because you have to acknowledge that he didn't always tell the truth. You have to acknowledge that he was very keen on self-promotion. I think within the FBI, he was regarded as extremely brilliant, but very difficult to get on with. So when he became the best paid guy, best paid special agent, that was it. There was no prospect of further advancement because he was not promotion material. This guy was never going to be an administrator. And he was almost the very personification of the private eye you get in literature. You know, the guy doesn't fit in, he doesn't get on with the establishment, or he's a maverick member of the police force who'll never be promoted. He was that kind of guy. He was people in the FBI probably didn't regard him as heroic, but clearly he was.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think he's just such a fascinating figure. I think it would make for a great movie, and I'm sure Rhodri is open to options on his.
Can you say that again? No, clearly, please.
Okay, so I just want to shift focus a little bit and move up to the title of the book. I just wonder, to what extent were some of the figures that you speak about Nazi spies, or to what extent were they just German spies? So were some of the figures that you discuss in the book, were they ideologically Nazis, or did they just happen to be, German nationalists or people that wanted to support the German effort?
Well, I think that it was a mixture. The Abwehr really wanted to remain a professional naval espionage agency, intelligence agency. That was how Canaris regarded it. Canaris was not a Nazi. As you know, he was involved eventually in covering up a plot on Hitler's life and was executed for having been, as they saw it, anti-Hitler. And a number of the officers in the Abwehr, some of the more senior people in the Abwehr who ran it, regarded themselves as traditional German army officers first, and perhaps Nazis second, but they were more like fellow travelers than ideological Nazis. But the Nazi Party had as its objective right from the beginning the penetration of the Abwehr, and some of the agents that Pfeiffer was obliged to run in the United States. In fact, virtually all the agents were members of the Nazi Party, and not only members of the Nazi Party, but fanatically Nazi. Ignaz Griebel, whom I mentioned, for example, was a very, very nasty anti-Semite. And he was maneuvering and was successful in getting the help of the German authorities to get hold of property owned by a family in Germany called the Berliners. That was their surname, Berliner. He managed to get their property expropriated. Then he got hold of a gynecological practice in Vienna, which is owned by Jews, and that was expropriated for him as well. He published anti-Semitic pamphlets. He compiled a blacklist of Jews, such as LaGuardia, the mayor of New York, who would be done away with if and when the Nazis got into power. And he was quite an important Nazi spy in New York. After Lonkowski, he actually helped Lonkowski to escape. And after that, he was quite a leading figure in New York. I mean, these were really nasty persons and heartfelt Nazis, as it were.
Mm-hmm. And I believe that there's quite a lot of questions, so I'm just going to make one final comment, which one of the chapters that I found really interesting was the one on the McAlpin Hotel. And that sounds like a fascinating place. I believe it's now an apartment complex, but you speak about some of the things that go on there. It's fascinating, isn't it?
Well, it is. I have vivid memories of the McAlpin Hotel because when I arrived in the United States with my then wife in 1971, we stayed in a room in the McAlpin, and we slept for a while. And then she looked out the window and she screamed, and I thought, "Oh my God, she's seen something horrendous." But in fact, she only screamed because she could see Macy's, the shop across the road. It was coming back to one of my old interests to look at the McAlpin Hotel. Yeah, that was quite a bizarre plot. The attempt to entice Colonel Eglin, who of course was tipped off because the Americans got a tip off from the British, so this never happened. But the plot was so improbable. One wonders. I mean, this is a letter sent to headquarters in Germany, and my guess is that more seasoned members of the Abwehr would have vetoed that plot.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't have happened anyway.
I remember seeing a plaque at the McAlpin Hotel, and I believe that that's where Jackie Robinson was in 1947 when he got the call from the Brooklyn Dodgers to become the first player to break the color barrier in baseball. Anyway, over to questions and Amanda.
Hello. Hi, we have a very wide-ranging number of questions, so I'm going to just dive right in. Individual wants to know, how well did the FBI and MI5 work together?
Well, this tip-off that MI5 gave to the FBI is an example of the special relationship at work. But that special relationship was always open to qualification. And the FBI, the MI5 and the MI6, in fact, only gave the Americans information if they thought that there's a strict need for this to happen. And it was because Eglin was, they thought, possibly about to be killed, that they handed on the information. But they gave the information with strict instructions that the identity of the go-between, the cutout in Dundee, her identity, Jessie Jordan's identity, should be kept secret. But immediately the information got to the United States. The story leaked. People blamed the NYPD, the New York Police Force, for doing this. And MI5 were a little bit reticent after that in cooperating over the spy case. So when the trial came up, there should have been two key witnesses. One of them was this guy Griebel, who I mentioned, who had become an FBI informant and gave him a lot of information. But he absconded to Germany at the last moment. And the other key witness was meant to be Jessie Jordan, the woman from Dundee. Now, Jessie Jordan had been tried in secret by the British and she was in prison. But the Americans thought that perhaps she could be released for the purpose of giving testimony at the trial in New York. But the MI5 was not keen on this. So they sent the district attorney from New York, Lamar Hardy, traveled to Scotland and gave his daughter a holiday in Paris on the way. But anyway, he traveled to Scotland to interview Jessie Jordan, thinking he could take back a written statement. But the Scottish legal authorities proved to be very difficult. First of all, they said in typical Scottish manner, well, you'll have to pay all the expenses. And then they said, no, she's ours. You can't interview her. So they didn't. They weren't able to utilize that evidence at all. So the cooperation from MI5 was real, but it was contained, as it were. It was limited. And in the end, the main witness in the trial was Turrou himself. But Turrou came under heavy attack in the trial for being biased. George C. Dix, who was an attorney for the defense, launched a massive attack on Turrou. But in the end, the jury decided to believe Turrou, and convictions came along.
While we're on the English connection, was Turrou involved with any of William Stevenson's efforts to get the U.S. to come into the war?
No, he wasn't. He, as I mentioned earlier, he was blacklisted by J. Edgar Hoover, so he couldn't have any connection with Stevenson through that channel. But then he did manage to get himself into the army, and he was put in. General Beadle Smith, later director of the CIA, but in the war, he had the responsibility of trying to deal with Nazi war criminals, and he put Turrou in charge of an office to track down these criminals. And Turrou did a great job because he applied computer technology to the tracing down of Nazi suspects. So that was a job that he did in Paris. So he had no connection really with Stevenson and that setup. So he did, in the end, he did good work in the war, in spite of the efforts of Jade Cahoon.
That was true in Paris?
Yes.
Because one of the questions was, what did he do in Paris? So after he was...
Yeah, well, first of all, in the war, he worked for the army and later on for the United Nations for this agency whose job was to track down Nazi war criminals. And when he finished with that work, he became the security guy for John Paul Getty, the billionaire who lived in France. He did a little bit of work for Bill Smith, who became director of the CIA, some local work for Bill Smith. And after that, I think that he lived a long life of happy retirement. He became a bit of a celebrity in the Paris American community. Apparently, he was a leading force amongst them, especially amongst American military veterans who lived in Paris. So I think he enjoyed the remainder of his life, but he was also desperately anxious to get rid of the dismissal with prejudice. And in the 1960s, Hoover finally withdrew the with prejudice phrase from his letter of dismissal.
Fascinating. And a couple of questions about Agnes Driscoll. Where are the documents that substantiate that she sold the cipher machine? And also, is she still buried in Arlington Cemetery?
She is still buried in Arlington Cemetery. Where are the documents? Well, the documents I have, which is a report by Ed Tam, a senior guy in the FBI, is based on the evidence supplied by sources. So we don't know for sure that she did this. It seems very plausible from the evidence in this document. But what I would like to know, and perhaps your question has the same question in mind, I would like to know if the FBI followed up on the case. And none of the documents in my possession indicates that they did, or maybe there are documents, but I don't have them. So quite recently, I got in touch with John Fox again at the FBI and said, how about it? Can you find these documents for me? But he says he'll keep it in mind and take a look. But he's impeded at the moment because the National Archives are closed because of COVID.
Well, I just want to say we love John Fox and work with him closely. So it's always nice to hear his name.
Please remind him of my request.
All right, we'll get the archives open right away. Did the Abwehr stick to operating in the eastern part of the United States, or did they try to move into the rest of our large country?
The Abwehr, controlled by Pfeiffer in the Bremen station, operated exclusively they operated in the east of the United States, but quite broadly from the south right up to Canada, in fact. So it's quite a big area that they covered. But independently of Pfeiffer, who was supposed to be in charge in Bremen, because the Nazis were able to run their own spies and sidetrack the Abwehr proper, they sent Niklaus Ritter's brother. Ritter was the guy who got hold of the gyroscopic bomb sight. They sent his brother to San Francisco, and in San Francisco, they tried to bring pressure to bear on a local manufacturer in the DuPont Chemical Works, who had some chemical information of interest to national security. They tried to get, this guy was a German American. They tried to get the secret information out of DuPont. When he refused to supply the information, they kidnapped his wife and his daughter. And when he still refused to submit to blackmail, they killed him, and the two semi-naked bodies cropped up in the Chihuahua desert. So yes, they did operate in San Francisco.
How accurate is the movie Confessions of a Nazi Spy?
It's pretty accurate, yeah.
Nice.
It has a scene set in Scotland to do with the letter sent by Crown. Well, of course, it's a movie, and you know they take liberties. So there was a British story put out that the reason the letter was discovered was that the local postman got very suspicious seeing all these expensive stamps from the United States on letters received by Jesse Jordan, and it was really flagged up by British intelligence, not by British intelligence, by British propaganda, how clever and patriotic the postmen in Britain are, and how sharp-eyed and clever they are to spot when the German spies are sending the letters. So this is a big thing in the movie. It opens with this very clever postie, which is actually just a bit of a propaganda story put out by the British. But generally speaking, yes, it's accurate. Yeah.
We'll have to, maybe we can screen it someday when we can have people in our theater at the Spy Museum again. Okay, this is my question, because I loved hearing about the rolled up umbrella concealment and the fountain pen that was actually a syringe. And I know you have written so many books. Do you have a favorite concealment device along these lines that seems like it's sprung from a spy movie, but actually the spy movies were inspired by the real stuff? So.
I think you caught me out there. Having never engaged in this kind of work myself, I must confess to a lack of ingenuity and perhaps curiosity. In the days of micro technology, when microtechnology first developed, it became the fashion to give honeytrap women a little mic which they could conceal up their skirts. So I have a rather alluring photograph of one of these microphones which is slipped slightly down.
Fair enough. So it's a skirt mic. Well, I'm sure we could come up with
not an upskirts mic, but a skirt mic.
No, a skirt mic. Great. Well, this has just been so interesting. Thank you, Andrew, for leading the conversation with our wonderful speaker, Rhodri Jeffreys-Jones. Really a pleasure to have you here with us from abroad. That is one of the exciting things for us about doing these virtual programs, that we can have an esteemed person like you beam in and be with us all today. We do lots of programs. I hope if you have joined us today, you'll join us for more. We have an interesting program next Wednesday at noon. I'm going to be talking to two authors of books, one about indigo and one about cochineal. So a very interesting story of color as a supply that then became the target of economic espionage. So that will be quite different. That'll be next noon, but we try to have something for everyone. We hope you'll tune in. And if you enjoy our programs, we do try to keep them free, and we would love it if you would make a contribution to our Mission Resilience campaign. Any contribution that you make now between the end of the year will double. So, you know, $10 becomes 20, 200, 400, you can do the math. But we would love to have your support. We're thrilled to have you today, and thank you so much, Rhodri and Andrew. And we'll see you soon.
It was great. It was great to speak to you, Rhodri.
Okay.
Everyone, take care.
Bye.